Tonight's talk is sort of an introduction to a class I'm going to be teaching in November, which is going to be a sort of a history and an anthropology and kind of a deep dive into the various archetypes of the femme fatale in Western culture. So tonight's talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the Belle Époque, so mostly the last half of the 19th century, with heavy emphasis on France and the British Isles, mostly Western Europe. And again, we're going to be focusing mostly on the 19th century, but the class will actually be taking in a sort of a much larger range. And so tonight, I want to focus on three archetypes of the femme fatale, which I'm referring to as the beastly femme fatales. And those are the siren, the sphinx, and the chimera. There are three texts that I'm going to be referring to, and one of the things that I love to do when I teach is, supply the students with lots of links, not only to reading materials but also to suggestions for, film and for, musical selections, because part of the way that I teach as a cultural historian is really through multimedia and also through material culture studies, because what I like to do as a historian is really help people um, to feel their way, not just through the intellect and through the arts, but also through the senses, to really get a sense of what was going on at the time, which gave rise to a lot of the different you know um, subjects that we're focusing on in any particular class. So there are three books that I'd like to recommend. One is called Dreamers of Decadence. The second is called Idols of Perversity: Fantasies of Feminine Evil in Fantastical Culture. And the third one is an out of print, a very small art history book that came out in the early 70s, The Femme Fatale: Images of Evil and Fascinating Women by Patrick Bade. The quote up at the top is by Philippe Julien, who is the author of Dreamers of Decadence. And Philippe Julien is really important as not just as an art historian, but also as a cultural historian, because he was one of the first art historians to really go back and reassess the symbolist artists of the 19th century, who, by the time we get into the 20th century, particularly with abstract art, so much of this fantastical art, which very often is connected to literature and to music and to the realms of the imagination, had really been sort of denigrated, looked on as sort of glorified illustration, if you will, and kind of shoved to the side. And what Philip Julian really did was he said, wait a minute, this is sort of a vanished world. And there's a lot that we need to be looking at, that's kind of been forgotten. And I think over the last 50, 60 years, as the symbolists and the decadents and a lot of these, let's call them sort of the pictorial fantastical artists have been reassessed, is that we've come to understand that so much, and this is certainly a big part of what we, do at Morbid Anatomy, realms that had been pushed to the side, the occult, things that had fallen out of fashion, we've come to understand that these things are deeply and intimately connected to all of the arts and always have been. And just because sort of the mainstream critics and the mainstream historians have ignored them doesn't mean, that they don't have great import. And, over the last 15 years, you've certainly seen what I would call an occult turn, right? And if you're here tonight, I'm sure all of you are familiar with that turn, and it probably informs your own work. But I love this. This is a quote from Philip Julian that comes from Dreamers of Decadence. For a long time, the chimeras have slept, stifled by the images they have inspired. And for a long time, the sphinxes have asked no questions. Dust covered the books of poetry on the shelves and hid the pictures beneath a gray mist. So much of what we're going to be talking about tonight has been recovered, I would say, over the last 40 or 50 years and reassessed. So, the three things that I kind of want us to be thinking about and sort of putting together as we talk about these three beastly femme fatales, these three types, the siren, the sphinx, and the chimera, are that all of them come out of older traditions. I mean, these three definitely come out of the pagan tradition, right? The classical Greco-Roman tradition. But when we're thinking about the femme fatale, there are very, very deep roots that go back to biblical and also to pre-Christian mythical characters, indigenous European things different from the Greco-Roman. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the metaphors and the tropes that are connected to these things provide this very, very deep reservoir of images. So setting that to the side, I then want us to be thinking about how the historical events, cultural traditions, and social systems of early modern Europe, because we're going to be looking at sort of the post-Renaissance world tonight, focusing a lot on the 19th century, but this, what historians call the early modern period, sort of the Renaissance, up to the 19th century. There's so much massive transformation occurring in Europe that these older traditions and visual traditions, right, the tropes of the classical and the biblical, are being reinterpreted and utilized in different ways. And one of the things that I want us to be thinking about tonight, and then hopefully if you come and take the class, we'll, be sort of expanding on this, is that, and this is true, I think, across the board in any time and in any place, is in any society, there are a sort of set of symbols and metaphors and stories. And in each generation or in each epoch, these are used in slightly different ways for different ends, because at the end of the day, that's what a metaphor is. It is a tool for thinking with. And very often, it to be used for very specific ends. So that having been said, I want us to think how the mythical materials mentioned in the first point are being reinvented, used, and interpreted for contemporary purposes by makers and their audiences. And in the case of the femme fatale, this is especially true when it comes to gender, because as we'll see, the femme fatale is a very specific way of thinking about the meanings of gender in the second half of the 19th century. So I want us to also be thinking about when we look at these female monsters or these femme fatales, what are the meanings that are inscribed on them? And also in thinking about the different elements, even of their bodies, what are the different things contained in those elements metaphorically that might be referring to specific fears or threats? Um, and what does this say about the culture and its discontents of the time? If you know the etymology of monster, I think this sort of ties in very nicely. Monster goes back to this idea of a divine omen. And if you think about the word demonstrate, the moner part of that goes back to this idea of showing. So a monster originally was some kind of a fabulous, strange thing, very often something that was born deformed or something that had a body that was different than the norm, that was read as an omen. And so monsters have this long history of being tied not only to prognostication, but also to being a sign from a higher power. The monster points towards something. And I think we can extrapolate and sort of read into that in a way if we're thinking about the monster as a metaphor, because it is pointing towards something greater, and sometimes towards something that's very deep and hidden and unconscious in the society. So before I begin, I kind of want to invoke two people who've had a big impact on me in thinking about this. One I've known for most of my life, and that's the late great writer Angela Carter. And so this is a quote from The Bloody Chamber, which I really love. One of her retellings of Beauty and the Beast. Like the wild beasts, she lives without a future. She inhabits only the present tense, a fugue of the continuous, a world of sensual immediacy as without hope, as it is without despair. So, and for those of you who know Angela Carter's work, she is interrogating and playing with these old forms of sort of the female heroine in peril, right? And so in her retelling of Beauty and the Beast, she's very often trying to also sort of turn these metaphors inside out. And she's telling us a lot about sort of uh, the metaphorical functions of gender, right? So in this case, if you think about sort of the traditional beauty, the traditional woman, particularly in this period of time, she's set apart as this sort of beautiful object that is kind of outside of time, and in that sense, she's close to being an animal, right? And we're going to talk more about this whole very bizarre, sort of strange, long connection between women and animals, and also this idea of how we differentiate human beings from the animal kingdom, because that has a long history. And if we're thinking about the beastly femme fatales, that long entangled history. What is a man? What is a woman? What is an animal? What is the relationship between these categories of living things? Um, it can tell us a lot, right? A book that's recently come to my attention, and I haven't read it yet. I've read excerpts of it. Is a groundbreaking book of feminist psychology, written by Dorothy Dinnerstein, who sadly passed away in the early 90s. She was a very popular early feminist activist. She was one of the first people to shut down Wall Street in the 60s. She was an ecologist. But for our purposes, I'm sort of invoking the mermaid and the minotaur because she came up with some really, really interesting theories about misogyny and how she put forward a pretty radical and interesting theories, and it's tied into Freud's ideas about gender as well. But it's about how, because in most times and in most places, and this isn't true at all times and in all places, but women generally are the ones who are raising children. And so the way that a society creates its sort of gender structures around male and female impact us, whether we ourselves are male or female identified or whatever. We are having a relationship with a very powerful female figure in the beginning. Um, and it's quite a fascinating theory about how gender is structured very, very early on between mothers and their children. But she says this at the beginning of the book, and I think this is really beautiful, again, relating to the way that I want us to be thinking about this idea of the beastly femme fatale, right? Or the way that sort of animal or beast elements are inscribed onto these female figures. Myth images of half-human beasts, like the mermaid and the minotaur, express an old, fundamental, very slowly clarifying communal insight that our species' nature is internally inconsistent, that our continuities with and our differences from the Earth's other animals are mysterious and profound. And in these continuities, so what makes us like them, and also the differences, what makes us separate from them, lie both a sense of strangeness on Earth and the possible key to a way of feeling at home here. So this has more to do with the class in the fall, but it also is related to tonight because we're going to be talking about the 19th century. So if we're thinking about the image of the femme fatale, and particularly the image of the beastly femme fatale, we should also be thinking about sort of these three branches of the Romantic movement very broadly. I know this is a lot of information, but I think it's important to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to be doing. So in the 18th century, we have the Gothic and the neo-medieval movement that's happening in England. And people like Horace Walpole, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron. I've listed also the artists underneath the author versions here. William Blake, Henri Fuseli, think about the Pre-Raphaelites. These are people who are looking back to an idealized form of the Middle Ages with all of its attendant, mythological Arthurian tropes. And femme fatales are a huge part of this. The second group that I want us to be thinking about are the symbolists, and this predominantly is in France, although after the symbolist movement gets started in France, it spreads like wildfire. Attendant on the sort of symbolist movement and sort of a sister movement, and it's sort of entangled with it. And at certain times, it's sort of difficult to pull them apart, right? There's not like a clean line on the borders here, is the idea of the decadence or the decadent movement. And Baudelaire, Edgar Allan Poe, by being translated by Baudelaire and introduced to sort of to the French literary public, is considered part of this. And then, of course, Huysmans, who writes a book called Against the Grain. And then out of that, heavily dependent on this literary movement, are people like Felicien Ropes, Aubrey Beardsley, and then Gustave Moreau. Now, there's a lot of overlap, not so much with the Gothic and the neo-medieval, that's a little bit earlier, but they have similar concerns. And in all three of these movements, women as objects of either adoration or derision are playing a really powerful role as sort of mythological figures, but also as subjects. And I put up the image of the Beguiling of Merlin by Edward Burne-Jones over in the side here, because I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm sure most of you know the story. Merlin is seduced and overpowered by his lover student Vivian or Nimue. In certain versions of the story, she's a fairy being, but she definitely qualifies as a femme fatale. And she's not beastly, but she does qualify because she, in certain ways, is not mortal. Right? We're dealing with sort of a supernatural element here. So as I've said, there's tremendous overlap in these sort of these three movements, but all of them feed into what we're going to be talking about this evening. So let's talk about some of these major archetypes of the femme fatale before we get specific with the siren, the sphinx, and the chimera. Because siren, sphinx, and chimera draw on these other femme fatales, right? They all sort of interpenetrate one another, and there is commonality, predominantly because they are all reflections of, the sort of male psyche. So Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Lady Lilith, I have on one side, and then Felician Rope's The Temptation of St. Anthony. So in both of these cases, women are being shown as sort of objects of sort of male desire. And, Rossetti is, sort of one of the fathers of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, and he has this obsession with women's hair. Likewise, Felician Ropes, the women in his images are always being offered up as sort of these sort of profane temptresses. But this idea of the woman, whether she's mortal, immortal, whether she's beastly or not beastly, represent this sort of very, very sort of strange, powerful, tempting figure, right? And going back to Eve and different archetypes out of the Bible, and also out of classical mythology. Sister to the temptress is also this idea of the beheader. So you will, of course, Salome being sort of the ultimate one. And in the class, we're actually going to spend a whole week on Salome. An image by Lucien Levy-Demer from 1896, and then also a little bit later, Gustav Klimt's image, not of Salome, but of another biblical beheader, Judith with the head of Holofernes. So again, this image of the femme fatale who conquers man and then also destroys him. So the femme fatale, as both the seducer and the destroyer, is one of the sort of main archetypal elements that we're going to be talking about tonight and then also in the class. There is, unfortunately, so much misogyny woven into this, and not just in the imagery itself, which I think we can, aesthetically we can appreciate, and it's absolutely beautiful. Gustav Moreau happens to be one of my favorite artists. But if you start to read his journals and his letters, his opinion of human women is fairly low. Very, very strange character. We don't have time to go into his life story. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the full class. But he painted Salome over and over and over again. And this is one of his really deeply misogynistic quotes from, I don't know if this is from a journal or from a letter, but this is his sort of take on Salome. This bored and fantastic woman with her animal nature, there it is, giving herself the pleasure of seeing her enemy struck down. Not a particularly keen one for her, because she is so weary of having all her desires satisfied. So again, this decadent idea of this is also very Orientalist, right? This idea of this sort of Eastern female figure who is just full, she's satiated with her vices, right? That's Salome. This woman walking nonchalantly in a vegetal bestial manner, comparing her to like a hothouse flower, comparing her to an animal, through the gardens that have just been stained by a horrible murder, which has frightened the executioner himself and made him flee distracted. When I want to render these fine nuances, I do not find them in the subject, but in the nature of women in real life who seek unhealthy emotions and are too stupid even to understand the horror in the most appalling situations. That's Gustave Moreau. So that having been said, we're going to return to the symbolists in a minute. I want to go back in time a little bit because one of the things that we're going to be really looking at in the class is how does this happen? How do we, when we get to the 19th century, how do we, and they are drawing on so many of these powerful goddess archaic figures. How do we get from there to here? That's a very, very complicated question to answer. There's not one answer for it, and I'm certainly not going to offer up one single one. But a big part of it has to do, of course, with the coming of the Judeo-Christian tradition and also with monotheism. And I'm not saying that in the ancient world there wasn't misogyny, because of course there was. But before the coming of Christianity, there was a very, very different way of organizing the divine, and it had a female face, right? So images from the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean world of these powerful goddess figures, which do find their way into a lot of these later femme fatales. An image of the head of Medusa, the Gorgonion, Hecate, of course, the triple goddess, and then the Ephesian Artemis. So three of the very, very great female deities coming out of very, very old archaic Greece, Anatolia, and then of course also the Near East. We have Ishtar, Astarte. We have Isis. We have Cybele coming out of the Anatolian area. So in the ancient world, we have these female powers of the earth and cosmos who are incredibly mighty, who have around whom entire religious systems and mythological systems are organized. But something begins to happen with the adoption of Christianity, in the Roman Empire in the third and the fourth century. And one of the things that I find really interesting is the transformation of female religious power. So here's an image, and we see this certainly in the case of the sibyls, right? The sibyls are these very strange, interesting prophetesses who exist in these very specific places in the ancient Near Eastern, North African, Mediterranean world. Here's an image of a sibyl from the Temple of Zeus. Then, of course, in the Renaissance, the sibyls are sort of rediscovered and celebrated and integrated into the Renaissance sort of Christian iconography. So, an image of the sibyls painted by Raphael. That's at the Santa Maria della Pace in Rome. A wonderful book by Jorge Guillermo called The Sibyls, gives you sort of a history of each of the different sibyls. And then fast forwarding again to the 19th century, we have a beautiful image by Elihu Vedder. This is actually at the Detroit Institute of Arts, of the Kumayan Sibyl carrying the Sibylline books with her as she's crossing this wasteland. And the whole story of the Kumayan Sibyl is actually quite fascinating when it comes to the history of Rome. But in the class, we're going to spend a whole week actually on the sorceress, the archetype of the sorceress, and the relationship of the sorceress when we're thinking about people like, Morgan Le Fay, Circe, and then, you know, the way that these are interpreted sort of in later periods of time in the Romantic period and also the modern period. But trying to answer the question, women, female characters who have direct access to the divine, how does that get cut off and shut out with the coming of Christianity in the Western world? And then how does it find its way sort of back in through the figure of the femme fatale? And that's one of the questions that I hope we'll be able to answer in the full class. Another element of the femme fatale, this will be in our week on the sorceress in the full class, is this idea of the demigoddess or the witch in the classical world. And of course, she has deeper roots going back to the archaic sort of Mediterranean traditions. But of course, we know these figures through the Greek epics. So the image of Medea, who's a part of the Argonautica and the stories of Jason and the Argonauts, and then her aunt, Circe, or Circe, as we usually say it, who is the great enchantress who turns men into beasts in the Odyssey. Interesting fact, if you look at the family trees of these women, Circe is the sister of Pasiphae, the mother of the Minotaur. And so these powerful female characters, these witch queen priestesses, very often are also partially divine. Very often their father, in the case of these two women, their father is the sun god Helios. They have a direct divine connection, and they go back, we think, to these bull cults. Really, really interesting stuff. So that's the classical tradition, which is certainly going to be playing into these beastly femme fatales that we are going to be talking about tonight. So setting aside the classical tradition, the archaic Greek tradition, and the tradition that comes out of the pagan world, which never really does go away, right, in the West. Let's talk a little bit about the Christian tradition, because when Christianity, flows into what will become Europe, and these older traditions are replaced, or um, let's see, what's another word? Because they're not really replaced, right? They're sort of covered over, and they find their way through it in various ways. um, we have different periods of trying to sort of imagine these different biblical stories. And so what's really interesting is in the Renaissance period and also in the late Middle Ages, you will see this image of the serpent in Eden, with a female head, and very often also with breasts. So the serpent, she, looks very much like, one of these figures coming out of the sort of classical pagan tradition. And you see this a lot in the illuminated manuscripts and the images of Eve talking to the snake. Um, the misogyny in the early church among not just the Apostle Paul, but also the early church fathers, particularly Augustine of Hippo, who is so important. Saint Augustine really, solidifies the idea of original sin, and uh, really, really is very, very sort of, I think we could say, anti-woman. I'll read this very quickly. I'm not going to read all of this, but we will be getting into a lot of these texts in the full class. Paul talks about women need to be quiet in church. They can't hold positions of authority in the church. And both he and Augustine justify this by making reference to Eve. And then later on, this gets worked out in the scholastic tradition, um, uh, by sort of tying theories of how the soul operates in terms of gender. So, and then a lot of that is also drawing on, Aristotle's work. So, in the Western tradition, we have this very, very sort of long history of gendering not just the body but also the soul, and that gets put together in various ways, and it's a very, very deep part of the history of misogyny in the West, and certainly undergirds a lot of the archetype of the femme fatale. And it's carried forward into the early modern and the modern period, certainly by Martin Luther, who has this to say: out of special hatred for our faith, the devil has sent whores here to destroy our poor young men. Such a syphilitic whore can poison 10, 20, 30, or more of the children of good people, and thus is to be considered a murderer, or worse, a poisoner. So again, there's also this long tradition of connecting witches to poisoning. And we're going to be talking about this in the class, the connection between sort of the understanding of how plants work, but also with the coming of syphilis in the early modern period, and the connecting of sex workers to this idea of witchcraft is going to be very, very important. And Martin Luther actually has a lot to say also about witches, because remember, in the early modern period is when the witch persecutions really get going. It's not a medieval phenomenon; it's an early modern phenomenon. A little bit later in the 17th century, we have somebody like Blaise Pascal, who is taking these older scholastic Christian ideas about Adam and Eve and the serpent, and 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 bringing them into a way of thinking about how mind and body actually work. It's really, really interesting. Saint Augustine, this is a quote from Pascal. Saint Augustine teaches us that there is in each man a serpent, an Eve, and an Adam. Our senses and natural propensities are the serpent, the excitable desire is the Eve within us, and reason is the Adam. Our nature tempts us perpetually. Criminal desire is often excited, but sin is not completed till reason consents. So why am I bringing all this up? Because I want us to be understanding that the stuff that we're going to be looking at in the 19th century is it sits on a very, very deep, very old gendered foundation. And because most of us don't understand this, I mean, most of us, in this lecture, who are in the audience get this. But I would say the general public doesn't really understand how deep the roots of this are. And because the roots of it are so deep, the metaphors very often keep operating, sort of in the same way. They get used in different, inflected in different ways. But what I would point out is that if you think about what's going on in the United States right now, as you're listening to the political discussion, as you're watching, what's going on between Trump and Kamala Harris, and all of the chattering and the stories that we're telling, because they're going to get very personal. They are very personal. Um, all of this is coming into play. So keep your eyes peeled for that, because a lot of these same metaphors are going to be deployed over and over again. Well, what's really interesting, if we're thinking about the idea of the beastly femme fatale, so the powerful female that has elements that are connected to sort of primordial power and animality, you've got some really, really wonderful examples going back in the really, really old sort of Greek stories. Like if we go back to like Hesiod's Theogony, and that's the idea that all of the monsters in Greek mythology are descended from Typhon and Echidna, who are these sort of primordial ancient monsters, right? So all of the creatures that Heracles and Theseus and a lot of these other heroes are going to be fighting in the epics are descended from this she creature named Echidna. Likewise, in the medieval traditions of Europe, particularly in France, a lot of the noble families who are Christian track themselves back to sort of these non-Christian roots, right? And one of these is the Melusine. So the family of Lusignan, the Angevins. There are a lot of these noble families that claim that they are descended from this beautiful water spirit, who in some of the old medieval manuscripts is shown as part dragon, sometimes as part serpent, sometimes as part bird. And she's a really, really wonderful, interesting figure. And she comes out of the old sort of fairy tradition. So we've talked a little bit about the classical tradition, we've talked about the biblical tradition, but in the Western European world, there are older, what we'll call sort of indigenous European traditions, right? And if you think about Scandinavia, if you think about the Slavic realms, if you think about places like the Faroe Islands and the British Isles, there are these female spirits who take the form of animals. You've got the Holder folk up in the north of Scandinavia, who very often will appear as beautiful women, but they have cow tails or they'll have hooves. You have the Swan Maiden, which is found throughout Europe. And then you have, creatures like the Selkie or the Seal Maiden. So, and you find this all over the world, of course, right? In both male and female form, but the idea of the skin changer. And so when we're looking at the 19th century and the beastly femme fatale, this is a part of that tradition as well. In fact, the middle image that you're looking at right there, I cannot remember the name of the artist. He's a wonderful Russian symbolist who paints these fabulous creatures, demons and swan maidens, and really, really marvelous. So again, if we're thinking about sort of the modern Western world, there's a shift that also happens. I've talked a little bit about the witch hunting. We're going to be talking more about that in the full class. The last course that I taught for morbid anatomy was a history of fairies. And we did a really deep dive into the early modern period, looking at how a lot of these nature spirits, which Europeans have always had a connection to, really became demonized by the church after the Protestant Reformation in particular. And so the image of the witch, the image of the fairy, which, these they could be mischievous and they could be dangerous, but in the early modern period, they become downright satanic. And so much of the femme fatale imagery in the 19th century draws on this tradition of the witch and the fairy as something that is satanic, bestial, and incredibly dangerous, and also tied to the devil. So the other thing that I want us to be aware of is that in the modern period, as we move into the 18th and the 19th century, there are two, and also if we're thinking about print culture, right? Because in the 19th century, especially, the media as we know it now, obviously there's no television, but there, is print culture, and there is an increasing literate, public. if we're looking at the 18th and the 19th century, there are images of women and images of the family that are really finding their way sort of into the common parlance. And one of these is the revolutionary woman. So you have images of liberty, the goddess of liberty, and then also images of female revolutionaries that are sort of flooding the sort of mass consumed image world. So I just wanted to put up this really powerful image of the Women's March on Versailles, which happens in 1789. And that's when a lot of these working women in Paris, I mean, it's not just women, but women are leading this, storm Versailles. And it's a really, really powerful moment. But I'm contrasting that also with the image of the 19th century sort of bourgeois, upper middle class noble mother. So this is an image from the Biedermeier period. And so when we're talking about the femme fatale in the 19th century, images of women are constantly being sort of contrasted with the image of this sort of out of control woman who, and you'll see this certainly in images of like suffragettes, the woman who is not in control or who is violently rebelling, right? She becomes really, really scary. Contrast that with this ideal sort of mother who is in this enclosed space and represents calmness. This is something that there will be this sort of back and forth between these two sort of extremes. Um, and it's really interesting because before we get to the sort of femme fatale in the 19th century, there's a much, you find this in Gothic literature. Remember, I was talking about the Gothic movement at the beginning. You find the woman in danger a lot more. And you have what I would call, and you don't have the femme fatale as much as you have the homme fatale. And several literary critics have sort of pointed this out. There is sort of this woman as victim. You find this in the early Romantic period, you find this in the Gothic period, and it comes out in, the novels of Samuel Richardson, in Pamela, in Anne Radcliffe's early Gothic novels, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and then of course in the Marquis de Sade. So, although Sade is also going to play with the idea of sort of the femme fatale too, right? So he's got Justine, who's the virtuous victim, and then of course her evil sister Juliet, who's more in line with the idea of the femme fatale. But in the sort of 18th and 19th century, there's this very strange thing happening where we're migrating from this idea of the sort of female heroine as victim of a brutal male towards a much more powerful woman who is becoming more in alignment with this idea of, and we'll be seeing this when we talk about the siren, the sphinx, and the chimera in a minute. But there's a kind of a slide that starts to happen, and it also might have to do with what I was just talking about, this sort of idea of the revolutionary female. Also remember that Mary Wollstonecraft is writing, her early works on feminism. There's something happening in the late 18th century around revolution. It's not just revolution tied to the state. It's also the idea of the revolution in how gender is defined. What is the meaning of a woman and of her power? But if we're thinking about sort of the way that Christianity has influenced the idea of male and female, who has control over their sin nature more or less, there's also a long tradition of man's relationship or human's relationship to animals. We get this out of the classical tradition because certainly the classical philosophers and theorists are coming up with ideas about how human beings are superior to animals. But also in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have this idea that human beings are created to rule over the world, right? They're given dominion. So I have an image on the left here of Adam naming the animals. And then there's the story in the Bible. Here's a really beautiful image by William Blake from the Romantic period of King Nebuchadnezzar being cursed by God and having to become an animal, I think like for 7 years. So there is this very sort of interesting dichotomy, and we're going to see this as we move on in the lecture here, of this of this sort of anxiety that we have. What makes us human and what differentiates us from animals? And when we're talking about something like the femme fatale, particularly the beastly femme fatale, when we're talking about madness, when we're talking about, characters who are behaving in an inappropriate way, the way that the attributes of animals are laid onto them or applied to them very often resonates with these deeper ideas about the relationship of humans to animals. And that also very often becomes gendered. And oddly enough, not only is this biblical, but when we get to the 19th century with Darwin's publication of, The Origin of Species, and then that's adopted by the social Darwinists and used for their own purposes, there is an even greater anxiety in the Western cultures. Let's about like how do we define ourselves now? Darwin is telling us that we actually are related to animals. So I've just put up some caricatures here because this idea of combining sort of animal and human parts in the visual culture of the time really finds an incredible flowering in all of these satirical images of Darwin, sort of, putting him on the body of a pig, sort of mocking the idea that human beings are related to animals. And again, as this is adopted by more people and used for their own purposes, particularly like the social Darwinists, the idea of how women fit into this also becomes not only more complicated, but it also tends to reinforce what has gone before it. So Darwin thinks that there's an evolutionary difference between men and women, and he puts women evolutionarily below men. And This is also tied into ideas. We don't have time to talk about this tonight. We'll talk about it in the class. But in the 19th century, when we're looking at images of the femme fatale and we're looking at images, sort of in the symbolist and the decadent movements, social Darwinism and Darwinian ideas aren't just tied into gender or the idea of how human beings are related to animals. It also gets applied to societies and civilizations. So, this sort of hierarchical way of how humans are related to animals, how they're related to sort of the chain of progress, gets mapped onto other cultures. And then that creates a whole other range of very complex issues around the colonial project. So, believe it or not, scientific theories, theories of gender, and the history of colonialism all become woven together in the image of the femme fatale. And in the full class, we're going to be sort of exploring the ramifications of that and seeing how that is brought forth. Um, I can't recommend Bram Dijkstra's book enough. I mentioned it earlier. And he's just absolutely wonderful. I don't have time to go into all of the quotes here. I pulled this up. This was from an essay. It's actually quite fascinating, talking about the relationship of sort of bestial femme fatales and the suffrage movement. But the reason I pulled it up here was actually because there was a quote that the author pulls out of Bram Dijkstra's book on sort of evil women in the 19th century. And so she's quoting him, and he's quoting a German zoologist, bear with me here, who in 1864 says, "Whenever we perceive an approach to the animal type, the female is nearer to it than the male." And that's a quote from a German theorist in Bram Dijkstra's book, Idols of Perversity. And then she goes on to talk about how Gustave Moreau and Felician Ropes actually are also drawing on this sort of Darwinian idea about how women are actually closer to animals than to men. You see this, again, I mentioned earlier, sort of in images of the sort of revolutionary female versus sort of the bourgeois female in the 19th century. This comes up in a lot of these political cartoons where the British are looking at their form of government versus sort of the French form of government, because there's a lot of talk about how the British know how to do governance, right? I mean, of course, this is the British speaking. We don't have revolutions, we reform. Well, of course, they've had their own revolutions, but they tend to forget that, right? And so I think this is really interesting. This is a British political cartoon showing the sort of difference in sort of their different versions of sort of lady liberty or governance. So you have the British on one side, and then of course you have the French on the other, and you can even see how in the French version of liberty, she's carrying, a spear with a severed head on it. And oh, look, what's that? She has snakes on her head. So the Medusa archetype is also being employed. I'm not going to talk about Medusa tonight. We will talk about her in the class. And I know that there's a full class actually on the history of Medusa that's been offered at Morbid Anatomy, which is super fascinating because it's such a rich, rich archetype. But you see it here too, this idea of the sort of the female, the sort of female monster in relationship to what we're talking about during this tumultuous time of the late 18th, early 19th century. And again, this is also tying into this idea of, about how human we are or inhuman we are. This is really great. The Great Sea Serpent of 1848. So 1848 is a year in Europe when revolutions happen across multiple countries and empires. It's happening in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's another revolution happening in France. And so you see this sea serpent with the head of the goddess of liberty or Lady Liberty, and a little boat filled with all of sort of the various kings and rulers of Europe looking with horror at her. Similarly, you see a political cartoon here. You have a utopianist sort of free love advocate, and she's holding up a sign that says, "Be saved by free love." And of course, she has bat wings and ram's horns. And then there's a woman who has an alcoholic husband on her back and a bunch of children, and who is, despite all of these horrors, still trotting the rocky path of motherhood and self-sacrifice. Um, there's a book that we'll talk about in the class, and I'll go more deeply into it, written by Patricia Matthews, which looks at the symbolist movement in art in France and how a lot of these male symbolist artists adopted in many ways a very what we would call sort of a feminine aesthetic, things that we would now sort of see ascribed to sort of more feminine ideal, right? A more feminine ideal. And yet women, female artists who wanted to also participate in this, I'm putting up images of Camille Claudel and also Suzanne Valadon, were not really fully allowed to participate in the symbolist project. The sexism, and this is sort of true across the board in the pre-Raphaelite movement, you do have women artists who very often are working at the margins of these different movements and also sometimes doing their own thing, but they're being ignored, by the men at of the time. And so passionate discontent is sort of an exploration of that. Um, so much of what we're looking at tonight, the images that we're looking at, and sort of the idea of the femme fatale are, of course, coming from the male imagination and male projection. But I want to say that um, in the full class, I really want us also to be thinking about the women creators, the women artists, and also the women theorists. We're going to be talking about in the class the work of Karen Horney, who was one of Freud's pupils, um, who said, women don't have penis envy, men have womb envy. So the femme fatale will be striking back, in the class. But I wanted to put this up because I think this is a really recent exploration of like, okay, we're talking about the subject of the femme fatale. We're talking about things like the Sphinx. But what's actually also going on at the time with the human women themselves who are also uh, creating art and sometimes also working with these same themes. What are they doing and how are they being how are they negotiating or not negotiating, not able to negotiate, with the men who are sort of controlling the discourse. So again, if we're thinking about the sort of beastly femme fatale, if we're thinking about the symbolist movement, the decadent movement, and again, this also is going to be tying into the idea of the three sort of beastly archetypes that we'll be looking at in just a minute. The femme fatale is also related to this idea of disease and disillusion. Just as Martin Luther several hundred years before is talking about the rise of syphilis and blaming prostitutes for it, not putting any sort of blame or concern on the men who are bringing it home to their wives or getting it. Um, this idea of the prostitute or the woman who is a part of the demimonde, where a lot of these male creatives are spending their time. The femme fatale becomes the sort of archetypal representation of the disease itself or of the addiction itself. So I've put up two images here. One is Felician Rope's Street Corner. So you see the prostitute, and she actually has a skull sort of as a mask in front of her face. And then, of course, the image of the green fairy. So we have an image of the absinthe drinker. And the green fairy, we talked actually about her at length in my fairy course, is an image that, becomes very popular at the time. And a lot of the artists are actually creating actual images of this sort of beautiful, seductive, transparent female figure who is a representation of sort of the absinthe, drug fueled, um, fantasies of these artists, right? So there's this idea that we find sort of throughout the image of the femme fatale that the ruin of sort of the male protagonist is being brought about by these feminine powers who are the personifications of these men's addictions or these men's vices, right? I can't wait to talk about this in the full course. But so much of the symbolist and the decadent femme fatale arises out of the concerns of the occult. And of course, the 19th century is, sees several occult revivals, but that's certainly something that we're going to be talking about. Like, how does the femme fatale archetype in her mythological form and in her other forms dovetail with the actual occult practices or occult concerns of the time? And this also ties into this idea of the femme fatale as a supernatural being. The femme fatale not so much as a human woman, but as a goddess or demigoddess. And so if we're thinking back to earlier in the lecture when I was talking about these sorceresses, whether we're talking about Circe, whether we're talking about Medea, whether we're talking about Morgan Le Fay or Nimue or Vivian, any of these characters, um, the femme fatale is this very often, and she's not always evil. Sometimes she plays sort of a muse role, right, or a guardian role, but she is otherworldly. She is a throwback or a sort of a way to channel these much older sort of, I would argue, female powers that have been submerged or buried. So two wonderful images by Jean Deville, Portrait of Mrs. Stuart Merrill, and then of course his very famous Idol of Perversity. But again, the femme fatale who is divine also dovetails with the femme fatale who is an archetype for death. Sometimes she's even figured as a personification of death herself, as in Carlos Schwab's The Death of the Grave Digger, where she takes on a kind of a siren angel form. And then another image by the wonderful Carlos Schwab of death from his illustrations for Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. And if you don't know Carlos Schwab's work, I would urge you to go give him a Google. His illustrations for the Flowers of Evil by Baudelaire are absolutely just delicious and really breathtaking. Edvard Munch is another person who really is drawing on these themes of the femme fatale as not only this divine but also this deadly character. And like Gustave Moreau, if you read his writings, um, has a fairly dim view of women in general. Even though, of course, he had relationships with women. He has some the things that he says about them are drawing on a lot of the. There's a weird conjoining, right, of a lot of these sort of archetypal images and the actual strong emotional relationships that he and a lot of these artists have with the women in their lives and the dim view that they take of women in general. So I put these two images up because they're drawing on what we're talking about. One is the harpy, and the other is Love and Pain, which audiences have often called the vampire. Munch said, I never called it that. It's just a woman kissing a man on the back of his neck. But the title of the vampire has actually stuck. So these three femme fatales that we talked about, that really, the title of this whole talk, they draw on all of this, right? And so in the full class, we're going to spend one whole week on the siren, and we'll actually spend one whole week on the Sphinx as well. The Chimera is a little bit more complicated, and she will sort of wind her way through sort of the whole class. So the siren is the mythical figure. Sometimes she's pictured as a bird, originally she is, sometimes later on as a mermaid, but she is tied to the sort of idea of sound or of seduction, right? So there's actually a very interesting passage in Plato where he talks about the music of the spheres, he talks about necessity, he talks about the way that the universe is sort of hooked together, like in a kind of metaphysical mechanics. And part of what makes the sound of the universe are these sirens that sing. Really, really beautiful idea. You also have sort of these indigenous European ideas of these female figures that give off sound. One of them is the Lorelei, and that actually goes back to an actual sonic phenomenon in these particular rocks on the Rhine River. We'll talk more about that in the class. But there's a long tradition of the idea of this female power in nature whose voice is seductive. And out of that seduction, very often will come ruin or shipwreck, right? Because, of course, in the classical tradition, the most famous story of the sirens, comes out of the Odyssey, where Odysseus or Ulysses actually has to pass through the island of the sirens, and their song is so seductive, as we know, that he has to stuff his ears with beeswax. And well, actually, he doesn't. He has his men tie him to the mast because he really, really wants to hear what it sounds like. But the rowers, his crew, stuff their ears with beeswax so they won't hear the song of the sirens. So Ulysses, is sort of the archetype of the artist or of the hero who does actually get to hear their song and lives to tell the tale. So the siren song, if heard and if we aren't restrained by our own reason, or in this case, rope, it will be our undoing. And that's a theme, of course, that the symbolist will play a lot with. Some more images here. John William Waterhouse's wonderful image. He's the one who painted the image that we just saw. But here, instead of the bird figure, he is thinking of the siren more in her mermaid form. And we'll talk about sort of the entanglement of the mermaid and the siren, and sort of that's a very, very long history. But by the time we get to the 19th century, that history is well established. And so again, you have this young man who may or may not be drowning, and he is, sort of in the subservient position here. So there's also, with the image of the femme fatale, this idea of sort of the BDSM image, how power is being used, who's got the power, who's desiring who's in control. All of that is certainly going to be coming into both the art and the literature of the 19th century. And then when we get to people like, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, it's going to get played out in sort of other in other more erotic ways too. But that idea of the siren, the idea of the beastly femme fatale, will play into a lot of the erotic literature in the modern period of the 19th and early 20th century. A rather comical and strange image by Hans Soma, 8 dancing women with bird bodies, certainly drawing on the siren archetype, but I find this to be somewhat more charming. Again, I want to leave time for questions, so we don't have time to go into all of the Gustave Moreau quotes here. But I'm putting them up because Moreau, all of the femme fatale images he works with all of them. He works with Salome. He works with the siren. He paints the Sphinx. He's an absolutely, well, he's one of the greatest painters of the 19th century, certainly one of the greatest symbolist painters. But his use of the femme fatale for his own purposes, and it's certainly not to get to know real human women in any way, shape, or form, but it's to play out his own sort of, his own fantasies and his own ideas. um, come into play constantly. And it's odd because if you look at the right hand side here, this is an image called the Siren and the Poet. So the siren here is operating as this really powerful muse-like figure who really has the poet in her grip. And it's interesting because this is a quote from Hesiod. I don't know if it's from the Works and Days or if it's from the Theogony, but here it is. There are two kinds of pleasure. The first, which is akin to appetites, voluptuousness, wealth, and can be compared to the homicidal songs of the sirens. And the second was which has its origin in beauty, justice, all that which is necessary to life, pleasant at the moment without the residue of remorse, and not unlike the harmony of the muses. So there is also this really interesting history of the relationship of sirens to muses. And sometimes it gets a little confusing because, and you'll see this throughout the study of the femme fatale archetypes of all of them, the male artists predominantly that are using these images are obviously using them as forms of inspiration. They're or they're seeing it that way. So the femme fatale as siren, as seductress, or sometimes as destroyer, is also muse. So a lot of these old sort of archetypal female powers drawn from the classical tradition become a very strange way to think about sort of the male psyche and its relationship to how it feels about what is inspiring it, or sometimes foiling its inspiration. Two more images from the period. Carl Joseph Bega's image of the Lorelei from 1835, so the early Romantic period. You see here she is appearing as a very beautiful human woman. One of her breasts is exposed. She's playing, looks like a lute or mandolin. And the mirror is, of course, next to her because mermaids are often shown with mirrors because there's this whole idea also of vanity, right? So the symbolism of the mirror, the symbolism of all of the sort of seductive appurtenances, let's call them, right? The material cultures of seduction or of the lady's boudoir, of the courtesan, really. These are very often surrounding these seductive figures. And of course, if you look down at the lower left-hand corner, the young man who's reaching for her out of his boat, looks like the boat's sinking, doesn't it? Likewise, in Gustav Adolf Massa's incredible The Satiated Siren from 1905, the whole world has been drowned here. So you see cathedrals, you see the tops of buildings, and you see a shipwreck. So the siren's work is done because not only the ship, but also civilization itself has, gone under. The Sphinx is the second archetype that we're going to be looking at tonight, but also it's going to take up a whole week. She will take up a whole week. He, she, it, they. The gender of the Sphinx is very ambiguous and very slippery, and also something that is an amalgamation of both, right? So we have the tradition of the Sphinx in Egypt, where it's mostly male and very often used as a representation of the ruler. But then we have the other tradition of the Sphinx coming out of the classical Greek tradition, and she's definitely female. And our word Sphinx actually goes back to an old Greek word for to strangle, because the Greek Sphinx would strangle her victims or choke them to death if they didn't answer the riddle, or perhaps embrace them to death. But the reason the Sphinx becomes so popular in the 19th century also has to do with a lot of the political situation, because there's a lot of colonialism that's happening in North Africa. Putting up an image here of Napoleon facing the Sphinx, and then and the painting is from the late 19th century, but Napoleon's campaign down in Egypt is the late 18th, early 19th century. And that's when Ang is doing his painting of Oedipus and the Sphinx. So part of the whole history of the femme fatale in the 19th century is also part of the history of Egyptomania. And so the passion and excitement and the sort of rediscovery of ancient Egypt through all of these early archaeological and, let's face it, plunder projects of Western Europe, are dovetailing with a lot of the images of the Greek Sphinx and all coming together in kind of this blinding flash of exoticism, of Orientalism, and all of that is feeding into the femme fatale archetype of the Sphinx. Two images of an American symbolist, Elihu Vedder, very, very exciting artist. If you don't know his work, I would also urge you to give him a Google, is drawing on both of these traditions in his work. So we have the questioner of the Sphinx, where he's, painting a sort of a romanticized image of an Egyptian leaning against a contemporary Egyptian person leaning against the Sphinx and perhaps trying to listen for a prophecy or advice. Some of you might know there's a whole tradition of the whispering statues or the singing statues of Memnon down in Egypt. Long tradition of this idea of Egyptian statues uttering oracles or giving off certain types of sound. But then he's painting the Sphinx from the Greek tradition as well. And so he's got this sort of femme fatale, mysterious lady Sphinx on a seashore. And of course, she's surrounded by what looks like skulls. So the two different traditions, the Sphinx as the image of sort of arcanum, secrets, and mystery, and then the Sphinx as this sort of terrifying asker of riddles. And if you think about those two sort of traditions, they come together and sort of become cemented into one thing, even down to the present day. The Sphinx, when we're talking about the Sphinx, I would argue that both of these traditions very often come to mind. Case in point, the Dutch symbolist painter Jan Turap, the Sphinx from 1896. You have this beautiful female Sphinx, but she is in sort of, typical, stereotypical sort of Egyptian headgear, but sort of playing on this idea the Sphinx is sort of the sort of mystic arbiter of fate, if you will. The Sphinx as the femme fatale really, really comes to fruition in the very strange and wonderful work of the Belgian symbolist Fernand Knopf. I'm sure many of you know his work. The Caress of the Sphinx, one of his most famous paintings, which makes a number of appearances in cinema. In the 1982 film version of Cat People, there's a dream scene where Malcolm McDowell and I forget who the actress is, where they basically recreate this image. And then also it shows up in Martin Scorsese's The Age of Innocence. It's sort of in the background. But the Sphinx is a leopard sort of caressing this beautiful young person. And Knopf used the female animal hybrid a lot in his work. And a sort of a fun tidbit, the female model he used mostly was his sister. And so here's the meeting of animalism and the angel, where we have the angel as sort of this, I don't know if it's male or female, but certainly representing sort of the idea of reason, right? The mind, or the guiding principle, the higher principle. And then the female Sphinx looks like she has a tiger body representing animalism. So there we're getting into that whole sort of the gendering of the idea of the different parts of the mind or of the self and its relationship to animality and also to gender. And then a very peculiar image, which he titled The Sleeping Medusa. Clearly, if we know our mythology, that's not Medusa, that's a harpy or a siren or something. But he titled it The Sleeping Medusa. Really, really beautiful. I believe it's a pastel. Two more images of the Sphinx. Gustav Morosimo's famous image of Oedipus in the Sphinx, which you can see in person. It's enormous at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And also Felician Rope's rather creepy female Sphinx, but she has a flower sort of arranged in a way that looks like an erect phallus. And he liked to do that a lot. And that also has to do with some of his bizarre theories about, well, I won't get into that. We'll talk about that in the class. He was very into sort of the study of sort of the medical theories around lesbianism and transgenderism. It really, really fascinating and interesting character. We'll talk more about him in the class. But this is one of his very strange images from the poet Verlaine. Quite beautiful, quite strange and mysterious. The Sphinx by Franz von Stuck, painted in 1904, is actually replicated in this photograph by Colette and then also by Ida Rubinstein. A lot of these, and this is when we're going to be talking more about female empowerment in the class, where a lot of these female stage artists early in the 20th century are kind of co-opting these male designed femme fatales for their own uses. So here's an example of that. And again, this is a little bit later than the Belle Epoque, right? We're sort of in the fin de siècle, early 20th century here. But I just wanted to point this out. It's very interesting. So you've got this image of sort of the nude femme fatale reclining on her belly, making her look like the Sphinx. Also, oddly enough, this image makes an appearance in Altered States. Blair Brown's character in one of the dream hallucination sequences. Go look it up. It's really fascinating. Some of you might know this. And I was like, why does that look so familiar? And it's like, oh yeah, Altered States. Another incredible Franz von Stuck Sphinx, the kiss of the Sphinx. So here we've moved over from the idea of the Sphinx, being the devourer of man to the, she's the seducer. It's hard to tell. Maybe she's going to eat him after she kisses him. And then Valère Bernhardt's The Sphinx from 1896, in which she takes on a much more siren or chimera form. You can see she has sort of a serpent or a dragon body. And I think she's already killed him in that picture, that image. Okay, so we're going to end with the chimera. And the chimera is very interesting. I grew up pronouncing it chimera. I was a reader and no, I didn't read out loud a lot. And so before I learned to pronounce the word correctly, I always said chimera, but in French, of course, it's la chimère. Um, but it's the triple hybrid from Greek myth, and we don't typically think of the chimera as being female, but she is female in the old tradition. And she is one of those monstrous children of the ancient echidna, right? Like the Nemean lion and a lot of these other monsters that Heracles and these different heroes fight. In this case, the hero that fights her is Bellerophon. So here's a wonderful Etruscan bronze of the chimera. She is part lion, part goat, part serpent, or part dragon. Beautiful Roman mosaic from the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. But when we get to the 19th century, la chimère, the chimera, becomes, for the symbolists, an idea, more of an idea. I mean, she is often femme fatale, but often more of an idea for the imagination itself. So La Chimère, chimera, is a fancy, it's an idea, it's a fantastical concept that has come to possess a person who dreams or fantasizes too much. This is very interesting. Gustave Moreau worked on a massive painting called The Chimeras for many, many years. He never completed it. If you go to the Haas Museum in Paris, which I would urge you to do if you haven't been, it's absolutely incredible. You can see this along with hundreds of his other works. This is his quote, again, incredibly misogynistic, but also letting us into this idea about how the fevered imagination is overtaken by its own fantasies, right? These fantastic dreams enclose all the forms of the passions, the fantasy, the caprice of woman, woman in her first aspect, an unconscious being, a well of mystery, a spirit of evil under the form of perverse and satanic seduction. That's a quote from Gustave Moreau. So there is this idea that the fantasy itself is also the thing that carries the fevered mind away. So oddly enough, even though the chimera can be a form of the femme fatale, Gustave Moreau doesn't necessarily see it that way. In fact, his other images, which are entitled chimera, show a woman being abducted or carried away or bearing forth a woman. So here's the one from 1867. A woman is clinging to a chimera, a male. And then in 1884, he did another painting of one that's much more serpent-like with wings, carrying a woman away. Very interesting sort of take on this old idea. But it's because the idea of chimera has come to represent, again, this idea that's a hybrid. And of course, many of you probably also know that if we're thinking about chimera as a term, it very often it very often is in reference to something that is made up of multiple animal or the parts of different species that have been put together, right? The Sphinx and the Chimera have a very interesting relationship in the 19th century, and there's a lot of imagery. I put up two images here, and that's because of Gustave Flaubert's very bizarre, I love it, a very, very interesting book. His peers at the time thought it was a piece of garbage. His friends urged him to burn it. Thank God he didn't. But it was the thing that possessed him his whole life, and he finally finished it and published it. The Temptation of St. Anthony. It is strange. It's nothing like Madame Bovary or his other writings. But in it, he has a very short passage where the Sphinx and the Chimera have a dialogue. And the Sphinx represents the sort of solid part of the intellect that is obsessed with numbers and study, and the Chimera represents fancifulness, fantasy. And so we have this wonderful image by Redon, who illustrated The Temptation of St. Anthony, and also Georges Rochegros, who did a series of illustrations. The Temptation of St. Anthony has been a great inspiration to many artists over the last 150 years. It has been illustrated a number of times, and I think if you read it, you'll see why. It's incredibly visual in its descriptions. But the symbolists loved creating these images. Two more images of chimeras that are also, strangely enough, bear the titles of the other monsters we're talking about. So we have Alexander Sayon's La Chimère, but it's the Chimera's Despair. But in other catalogs and in other exhibitions, it's titled The Sphinx's Despair. Likewise, Armand Point's painting, which I've actually seen in person, it was in a show a few years ago in New York on the Symbolists, is called the Siren now, but originally was entitled the Chimera. So by the time we get to the 19th century, these three creatures, the Siren, the Sphinx, and the Chimera, have kind of come to represent a very similar type of sort of metaphorical operation that's very often tied to this idea of a primordial, fantastical feminine power that is both seductive and destructive. And we're just about finished here, folks. So we'll open it up for questions in just a minute. Wanted to point this artist out. I just wanted to get him in here because I think he's so exciting. And he's I believe Polish. So bear with my pronunciation. Jacek Malczewski, I think is how you say his name, Malczewski. Wonderful late symbolist painter, late 19th, early 20th century, who loved the form of the chimera. He also does these incredible paintings of angels. And I love this. He did all of these wonderful images of the chimera, sort of as a muse, but also as like an oppressive lover. And she's just there's a sense of the comic about a lot of his things, and he very often does wonderful images of sort of like children coming into contact with angels or other mythical beasts, and there's a real playfulness. So you feel when you're looking, at least I do when I'm looking at his take on the chimera and these other creatures, that they are representations of our desires, of our fantasies, but they're done in a much more playful way. And anyway, that's my take on him. But I wanted to, if you don't know him, I wanted to introduce him to you because I think he's wonderful. And this chimera figure comes up in a lot of his works. I want to end with the divine Sarah Bernhardt, the great, great actress and sort of theatrical entrepreneurs and superstar of the last half of the 19th century, who is part of this whole process that we're going to talk a lot more about in the class of of women artists, very often on the outskirts, also women sex workers, women courtesans, women entrepreneurs of the time, who took the image of the femme fatale and used it for their own ends. So case in point is Sarah Bernhardt. We don't have a lot of time tonight to talk about her. Child of a courtesan, grows up in the demi-monde, becomes one of the greatest actresses of the 19th century, again, becomes a global superstar, and takes on a lot of the roles of the femme fatale, the exotic femme fatale, the historical femme fatale, the powerful woman, the destroyer. She plays Cleopatra. She plays Medea. She plays the Empress Theodora. And all of those figures as femme fatale archetypes we're going to talk about in the class, okay? Sarah Bernhardt is also an accomplished artist. Oh, the three images of her as a hybrid being. I love this. Here she is as this sort of a bird with a human head. Here is a fairy. Here's a fairy with this sort of diaphanous tail. But, you know, based on all the images we've been looking at tonight, if we're thinking about sort of the 19th century femme fatale, you see her pictured in these ways, in sort of a playful way, right, in these publications. Sarah is both a creature of danger and also a creature of privileged desire as well. But I want to stress that Sarah Bernhardt is also a really great artist, an incredible sculptor. And it's funny because the idea of the femme fatale, these images of these sort of dangerous and provocative women that come out of the Romantic and the Symbolist and the Decadent period. I mean, she is of that period too. She's a huge part of it. Um, she's making objects that are playing with these ideas. Here's her image of Hermione, who's an image, I believe, drawn from one of the classical Greek plays that she performs in. And here she is imagined with this Medusa snakes on her head and these wings. And this comes out of, I can't remember, it comes out of a scene in this Greek tragedy where she's connected to the Erinyes, the goddesses of vengeance. Here's a beautiful plaque that she did of the drowned Ophelia. We'll talk about Ophelia in the class too, the sort of mad woman archetype who's sort of a cross between sort of the victim and the femme fatale, right? But I thought this would be a great slide to end on. Here is Sarah Bernhardt's self-portrait as a chimera or a sphinx. It bears both titles. I'm not sure which she gave to it. It's a bronze inkwell, actually, but I just think it's marvelous. And I wanted to end on that because I think it's really important to sort of know that when we get to the end of the 19th century, and it's happening before that too, but there are a lot of women creators who are really saying, wait a minute, there are other ways to think about this. And I want to use these ideas as well and sort of turn them on their heads. It's certainly what Angela Carter is doing, you know, many generations later. So I hope I'll see some of you in the class or all of you in the class, but it's going to be a lot of fun. And this will give you a taste of some of the things that we're going to be exploring. I know that's a lot of information, but I wanted to share it with you. Thank you so much for coming. And shall we open it up for questions, comments? Thanks for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. That was fascinating as always and so good. I had no idea Sarah Bernhardt was such an amazing artist.
I know. I learned about it recently myself.
So let me get to the questions here. We have a lot of comments in the chat. I just need to scroll up because I wasn't able to see them during the screen sharing. I'll start with one here in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee that says the trope of the femme fatale embodies a mode of feminine power that explores dualistic themes such as birth/death, nurturer/devourer, and female/male dynamics, often depicted as subverting and annihilating male authority. This trope suggests a complex layers of female power and autonomy. And they have two follow-up questions to that. The first is, how do you perceive the connection between the femme fatale and the concept of the divine feminine? In what ways does the depiction of the femme fatale expand or challenge traditional definitions of femininity and feminine embodiment? It's a great question.
I think all of these different archetypes of the femme fatale represent, you know, energies, right? Whether you're talking about physical energies, the energies of relationship, phenomenal energies. And if you are, you know, if you are demonizing or ascribing, you know, all of the negative things or the fearful things to one of the, you know, of the two, what we're talking about, the two, you know, sort of two genders here broadly, how that's going to create some really, really strange situations. But because humans, you know, we work a lot of our stuff out through metaphors, inherited metaphors. So I think the conflict very often arises with the energies. You see this sort of like with the Virgin Mary, right? I mean, there's this massive flowering of what we call, you know, what we think of as sort of Mariolatry, the worship and adoration of Mary, you know, in the Middle Ages. And these are cultures that just a few centuries before had goddesses. So that energy, that relationship has to go somewhere. So I would argue that I think a lot of it really has to do with that. The way that these different types of energies and the way that they're gendered get sort of pushed into these different containers. And
Mm.
that doesn't always, make for sort of healthy outcomes. It's a big question, and that's a bit of a convoluted answer, but I hope that helps a little, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. Cora says, how have media and traditions from Swana slash Southwest Asian and North African region, such as Alflea, Walea, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from 1001 Nights, or Rocks Sharkey from the Belly of Dancing, a la Little Egypt, and their importation
Oh,
into the Occident during the colonialist era influenced the ways these beastly femme fatales have been portrayed, especially how
yeah.
strongly the imagery and mysticism of Egyptomania influenced the spiritualist and occult movements.
That's a really, really important. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in the class. It also has a lot to do with the way that biblical stuff gets imaged in the 19th century, because there's so much there's always been interchange, right? I mean, human beings have always moved around, but in the visual culture, particularly of the 19th century and the Decadent movement and the Symbolist movement, Orientalism is deeply, deeply tied into sort of the colonial projects. And a lot of it also has to do with just the material culture, because visually speaking, so much new imagery and so many new artifacts are flowing, so a lot of these artists are collecting these objects, right? They're collecting objects. People like Flaubert are actually spending time in Egypt. So, and then also their own understanding of what they're seeing, they're projecting their own stuff onto it, right? So there's all kinds of misunderstandings, there's all kinds of appropriation for their own purposes. And then, we'll definitely talk about Little Egypt and the idea of how that dovetails with the image of Salome. The first week, we're going to be looking at Salome, and so there'll be a lot of thinking through sort of the history of the relationship of the femme fatale to Orientalism. It's really a really important thing to understand.
Excellent. Oh, excellent. Thank you. And as a follow-up here in the chat, Cora had mentioned earlier in the talk that it was worth mentioning the pre-Raphaelites favored, quote, mummy brown paint created from smuggled and crushed bones
Oh,
of Egyptian mummies.
yes.
And they also say the transitionary period from paganism to Christianity in Egypt via the Coptic Church, which was one of the first Orthodox traditions of the
Ah,
Christian Church, is worth looking into if you're interested in that transmutation.
thank you. Yes, yes, yes. Fascinating stuff.
I have a comment here from Alicia Anderson, who I want to say is Alicia King Anderson, who teaches some wonderful classes on fairy tales for us, if that's correct.
Oh, wonderful.
But Alicia says the serpent was a symbol of archetypal feminine wisdom tied to rebirth, and it was definitely maligned in Christian imagery, but the woman's face taps into that archetypal connection.
Ah, yeah.
And we also have Liz Andres here, who teaches the Medusa class, who says,
Oh, hi, Liz.
yeah, fascinating. And she's so excited for the full class experience. So as these little notes of praise and thanks are coming into you, I'm just going to grab that link to your class to put here in the chat. And I'll also send it out when we send out the video so that folks can grab it and sign up now if they'd like to, or do so later in the week.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. We'll
I don't know if you turned the chat back on and you can see it, but you're getting a lot of love.
Oh, thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Okay, here is the link to the class that the lecture tonight was based on. Tete Montero is also here. Hi, Tete. She also teaches some wonderful classes
Hi.
on different modes of creativity for us. Wow, you really brought out the teacher contingent.
That's wonderful. Well, you're doing goddesses work, folks.